In this lesson, we're going to add the finishing touches to our BMI calculator. We're going to apply the MVC design pattern to add some additional functionality to our app. By the end of this lesson, our app will display a piece of advice text underneath the BMI value and also show a different background color depending on whether if the BMI that was calculated happens to be underweight or overweight. In the process, we'll learn how to work with color literals and also get more practice working with optionals in Swift. Speaking of optionals, prior to our optionals deep dive, we were looking at our BMI property in our struct. We transformed this property into an optional, and we were wondering how to best work with it in the getBMIValue function. So coming back to our project, having learned about all the ways that we can handle optionals, let's think about how we can apply those methods that we learned about to our optional value here. The first thing that we learned about is we could simply do a if BMI is not equal to nil, well then in that case, and only in that case, do we actually trigger this block. Now, once we re-indent our code, and then we go ahead and unwrap this BMI value safely within the check of our if statement. Now that error goes away, but we get a new error. It's telling us that we're missing a return in a function expected to return string. Because when we created this function, getBMIValue, we promised that we would give a string as an output by the end of this function. But you can see that if the BMI was indeed nil, then this entire block of code is going to be skipped, and we're going to land right here without having any value to give back. So what can we do? Well, we could provide a else statement. So we could say that, well, in the case where BMI is nil, then let's simply just return 0.0. So that's one way of looking at it. The other way is using our optional binding. So where we say if let safe BMI equal to BMI, well, in that case, as long as this has a value, then we should be able to use this safe BMI as an actual floating point number. So here we don't have to do any unwrapping anywhere, and we can just simply tap into the safe BMI. But again, in this case, we still need that else statement, because if the BMI is nil, then again, this block will be skipped and it will jump to the else statement. Now, if we wanted this code where we're using the BMI value if it has a value, otherwise providing a default value, well then this whole block of code could actually be vastly simplified by simply deleting the if and the else statement and using our nil coalescing operator. So in this case, we're going to say that, well, if there is a value in BMI, well then use that value, but otherwise let's just use 0.0 as the value that we format. So out of those three options, I would actually prefer this approach. The syntax with the nil coalescing operator is both more clear and more expressive. So now that we've figured out the BMI value, the next step is getting hold of an interpretation for the BMI value and assigning it a piece of advice as well as a color. Now, in that case, we should probably end up grouping our BMI value with its color and advice together in the same data type. So does that remind you of something? Well, it means that we should probably create a model for our BMI. That's right, we're going to build our app to be more in line with the MVC design pattern. So in our models folder, let's go ahead and create a new file. And it's going to be a Swift file. And let's go ahead and name it BMI. And make sure it goes into the models folder. In this BMI file, I'm going to create a new struct called BMI, and it's simply going to have three properties. A value, which is going to be a float, a piece of advice, which is going to be a string, and finally a color, which is going to be a UI color. Now notice how it's not coming up in my auto suggest here, and that should be a good hint to you that we actually are using something that we don't currently have access to. And this says just as much. because we need to switch our foundation to UIKit so that the UI color, which comes from UIKit, can be found and we can use it. So it's a pretty simple struct for our BMI. It's going to be a custom data type that groups together the value, which is the number, and then the advice text as well as the color. Now we can head back into our calculator brain, and instead of having our BMI being a float, I'm going to change its data type to being that new BMI struct that we created. But again, it's going to be an optional. So now that we've changed the data type, we have to do a few fixes in our code. And the first thing is that we should change this, which is no longer a value, a floating point number. It's now a BMI struct. Instead, it should become BMI dot value so that we can tap into that floating point number. But notice how as soon as I type the word value, what gets automatically inserted for me is that question mark there. And from the last lesson, when we did our deep dive into optionals, you should be able to recognize that this is effectively chaining our BMI optional. So because the value is a normal floating point number, but the BMI is of course the optional here. In order to reach into the BMI to get hold of that value, we first have to check to make sure that the BMI is not nil like it is here. And if it's indeed not nil, well then we can get hold of the value that lives inside. But if it is nil, then we're simply going to use 0.0 as our value. So that's our first part fixed. Now down here though, we can't simply just write BMI.value and use optional chaining to try to assign this to our value property in the BMI struct. Because remember that the value was set as a let constant. Once we create this BMI with the value, advice, and color, all we want to do is just pass it around. We don't want to change it. It's only ever going to have one value. And so that means what we actually want is to be able to create a BMI struct from scratch. So instead of writing BMI.value, let's create a temporary constant. Let's call it let BMI value equal height. And then we can create our BMI by using that BMI struct and then using the initializers to fill in each of these values. So the BMI value that we calculated, of course, goes into the value placeholder. And then we need a piece of advice and a piece of color. But these two things are worked out based on what value we got. Because the reason why the BMI is such a useful indicator for health professionals is because it takes into account not just somebody's weight, but also their height. A really tall person has the same weight as somebody who's really short, then the shorter person probably is more overweight. So in the BMI chart, you can see these different bands which classify the BMI values, where below 18.5 they are underweight, between 18.5 and 24.9 they are healthy, and then above that they are overweight, obese, and extremely obese. The National Institute of Health classifies some of these categories. And we're going to use these categories to create an if statement in our code. So as a challenge, I want you to look at the BMI value that we calculated from dividing the height squared by the weight. And then I want you to print underweight, normal, or overweight based on what that value is equal to. For this challenge, just print to the console for now. We'll be adding the functionality to show the interpretation inside the app in a bit. So take a look at this breakdown, pause the video, and try to complete this challenge. All right, so let's first comment out this line of code, which we don't have any values for, and then we're going to use our BMI value, which gets calculated, and we're going to check to see if the BMI value is less than 18.5. Well, in that case, then we should print underweight. But the next category for the normal weight is for people who are between 18.5 and 24.9. So how can we express that range? Well, we could use an else if, which only gets triggered, remember, if the if statement, this check, fails. Well, in that case, if it's not less than 18.5, well then is the BMI value less than 24.9? Well, in this case, we should be printing normal weight. And finally, if the BMI value is not less than 18.5 and it's not less than 24.9, well then we can catch everything else above 24.9 with the else statement and we can print overweight. So this is one solution to our problem. Now you might have done it slightly differently. You might have checked to see if the BMI value was greater than 18.5 and it was less than 24.9 to catch that particular range. And that would be the case if you only had an if statement. But if you have an else statement, remember that it's already checked the previous condition. It's already checked and made sure that the BMI value is not less than 18.5. And that's the point at which the else statement actually gets triggered. So we don't actually have to check the lower end, we just have to check the upper bound, which is 24.9. And that's the solution to the challenge. Now let's make use of this logic. So now, instead of printing underweight, normal weight, and overweight, let's instead create our BMI struct when we have these different categories. So if the BMI value was less than 18.5, well then maybe the advice is we should tell them to eat more pies. And the color that we will use to show that they're underweight is maybe we could just use the UI color dot blue. Now notice how UI color again comes from UI kit, and without importing UI kit we won't be able to use it. But there's another way that we could do this by using something called a color literal. And we're not going to use UI color anymore. Instead, we're going to start typing color literal. And once that hint comes up, we're going to hit enter. And now in this little square, we can double click on it and out pops a little color palette that we can pick from. Now, if these colors aren't enough for you, then you can click on other and get the full choice of RGB sliders or the rainbow or the crayons, whichever one you prefer. But in my case, I'm simply just going to choose this light blue color for people who are underweight. And then for normal weight, I'm going to say maybe fit as a fiddle. And let's add an exclamation mark here as well to express our enthusiasm. And let me just fix my typo there. Now let's change this color to green for normal weight. And finally, for overweight, we're going to say maybe eat less pies, because that's what everybody eats, just pies all day. Now, and I'm going to change the color to red. All right, so I've got blue, green, red, and I've got a piece of advice for everybody from each category. And now we've calculated the BMI based on the values that were passed in. We've interpreted them and created a separate BMI struct for each value category. So let's tie everything that you've learned so far together with a challenge. Head back over to the Calculate view controller. And down here where we have access to this destination VC, which is the result view controller that's going to be shown up on screen, I want you to type 2 more lines of code. So we're going to tap into the destination VC and we're going to set a property called advice, and we're going to set it equal to the calculator brain dot get advice. And then we're also going to tap into the destination VC and set another property called color, which is going to be coming from the calculator brain, as always, and it's going to be called get color. So using what you've learned about optionals, about MVC and structs, I want you to complete this challenge by getting rid of the errors here. Now, you're not allowed to touch anything else inside the Calculate view controller, and you have to fix this code and make it work so that when you run the app and you change the height to some extraordinary number and click Calculate, it should calculate a low BMI, which means a blue background, which means eat more pies. And if you had a normal-ish sort of height and a normal-ish sort of weight, then you should end up with a green background with fit as a fiddle as the advice text. And finally, if you have a really low height and a normal weight, then you might get a higher BMI result with a different advice and a red background. So essentially, these two lines of code will allow us to pass on the advice that we get out of our calculator brain, the color that we got out of our calculator brain, and make it display in the result view controller. So there's a couple of things that you have to fix and you have to write, and it requires all of your knowledge that you've learned so far. Pause the video and try to complete this challenge. Alright, so there's a few ways that you could have solved this challenge, but first of all, we have to get rid of these errors. And through the code that I've written, it requires that we have a property called advice and a property called color in our destination VC. So that is of course going to be our result view controller. So here we've already got a BMI value, which is a optional string, because when we create the result VC, we don't yet know these values. We have to pass it over, because the segue creates that view controller, at which point we don't know any of these values. And it's only when we cast it down to a result view controller, and then we can set its properties. So we need to create advice and color over here. So I'm going to create a variable called advice, and this is also going to be an optional string. And then I'm going to create a variable called color, which is going to be a optional UI color. So now that should get rid of these two errors, and that's no longer highlighted in red. So let's go ahead and address the next part, our get advice and get color methods. So we currently don't yet have those things in our calculator brain. So let's go ahead and create it. Let's create a function called get advice. And this should probably return a string because the advice text is a string. And then let's create a function called get color. And this will return a UI color. So if you haven't converted your foundation into a UI kit, then you'll have to do that now in order for Xcode to know about this data type. So now it's saying that we're missing a return in a function expected to return. So in this case, we need to get hold of the BMI's advice property. So let's go ahead and try to return BMI.advice. Now it automatically chains our BMI, which currently is still a optional, and then it tries to tap into the advice property as long as it exists. But of course, if BMI was nil, then advice would also be nil. So therefore, this entire bit of code is actually still an optional string. So how do we turn it into an actual string? Well, we could use our optional binding, we could use our nil checking, or more simply, and to keep it short and sweet, we could also just give it a default value of no advice in the case where our BMI is actually nil. Now, in pretty much all circumstances, this would never get triggered because our prepare for segue is always going to be triggered after perform segue, which of course lives in the calculate pressed IB action, which already calls calculate BMI. Now we know this, but our code doesn't know, and there might be a case in the future where we've forgotten all about this. So to catch that optional being nil, we provide a default value, which should alert us that something has gone wrong. So let's go ahead and do the same in our get color. So I'm going to return BMI chained with the dot color property. In this case, I'm just going to provide a default color, say a UI color dot white, or if you want to keep it consistent with the rest of these, then it might be a case of turning this into a color literal. But of course, when there are errors, the color literal doesn't really pop up very easily in Xcode. So I find it's easier to just copy it from somewhere else and paste it in, and then we can double click on it to change it to white. All right, so now that we've created our get advice and get color methods, if we go back to our calculate view controller and hit Command B to hit our code with a stick, then that should get rid of all of those errors. But now you might realize that if we run our app, it's still not enough to get the advice and color being displayed on screen, because while we have access to them in these properties now, we're not using them yet. So in our viewDidLoad, in addition to setting the BMI label, I'm also going to set the advice labels text property to equal the advice string that we passed over. And notice how I'm not unwrapping these optionals. And the reason is because the BMI label.text property is actually expecting an optional string because it can be nil. You could have a label with no text, and that's perfectly fine. The label can handle that. So in this case, these two data types match, and that's why we're not getting any errors. But how do we set the background color? Well, remember that in the UI view controller, we have a property called view. And that view, of course, comes from the UI view controller, and it refers to this view that we see right here, which is, of course, the background of this screen. Well, that sounds pretty much like what we need to change in order to change the background. And notice how at the moment we've got this blue background showing up, but it could also be yellow, or it could be red, or it could be any other color, basically. So we're going to tap into this view, which we always have access to whenever we create a new view controller, and it's already linked to our code with a property called view by default. So every single time you drag on a new UI view controller from the object library and you put it onto the screen and you link it up with a UI view controller class, then you should have access to that view property, and that will determine what the background looks like. So let's go ahead and change the view.background color property, and we could set it to the color that was passed over. So now let's go ahead and run our code. And you should see that when we change our weight and height, our BMI gets calculated, and depending on the result, we get a different interpretation and a different background. So have a mess around with that and see what you get. And if you didn't manage to complete the challenge in its entirety, be sure to review your code and try to fix it so that it works. And if optionals were confusing, then take a look at the optionals deep dive. If this view property tripped you up, then be sure to take a look at the lessons where we talked about classes and inheritance. Now that's it for this module, and I hope to see you on the next one.